Hello, everyone, and welcome to our financial literacy podcast, where we take complex financial topics and break them down into bite-sized pieces. I'm your host, Karl Weiss, and I'm a residential loan officer with Fairway Independent Mortgage Corporation. I'm licensed in 21 states across the country, and what we're discussing here specifically today applies to our friends, family, and clients who reside in Arizona. Although the topics covered today apply throughout the U.S., it's our desire to help educate and provide serious value to assist our clients and our friends understand money, manage money, make money, and grow or at least keep more of their money that they have. Joining us today as our esteemed guest is Mr. Clayton Janson of Focus Financial. Welcome, Clay. Mr. Jansen's a certified financial planner and a true investment professional. If you've seen any of our other segments, you'll know that he is here willing to help and share his immense knowledge to help, increase financial literacy and just help people uh, get a little higher up on the knowledge train of investing. Clay, I'll welcome, and of course, I'll have you kind of start off maybe and recap where we left people off with our last segment, and I'll throw it over to you to expound on today's topic, which is an incredibly important and probably the one that we really try to, I think, focus on a lot, which is that third retirement bucket. So
Yep.
take it away.
Yes, my pleasure. Good to be back with you, Carl, as always. So yeah, last time we were talking a lot about buckets, right? And these different buckets that investors have. And we were talking about the short-term bucket, the mid-term bucket, and the long-term bucket. And in our last visit, we talked quite extensively about that mid-term bucket, right? That 2 to 10 year bucket. It tends to be the bucket that gets overlooked. But we kind of ended up talking a lot about how do you select investments. And
Correct.
we were talking about using tools, right? Analytical tools like Morningstar, where you could get in there and say, "Oh my gosh, Clay, I've got all these options. How do I end up picking something that fits in this bucket?" So using those tools that are out there, a lot of them are free online tools, which makes it easy for people just to get involved. And then that way you can see what's under the surface of those investments. So I think where you and I thought would be the natural next step is to talk about that long-term bucket. And one of the tools that people have that a lot of our clients and friends and community friends have is that 401k, right? And
Mhm.
so that long-term bucket, I always think of as 10 years or longer, right? It's the 10 years out or longer. You're probably not using it to put food on the table or buy a car, right? In the next couple of years, it really is intended for that retirement experience, right? Way down the road. So I thought, maybe this is a good place to jump in today is to get a little bit deeper on the 401k and how can people learn at their job with their employer currently, what is my 401k all about? What's under the surface, right? So I've got some thoughts and some resources I wanted to share with you and our listeners.
Yeah, I love it. And I think, I hear all the time. I mean, when people really start to dig deep into their 401k and they actually have, actually signed up for it, a lot of times they're eligible for a long time and then they finally, take the plunge, then they get incredibly overwhelmed.
Totally. Yes. Because it sounds so easy. Once you're eligible, it should just be this
Mhm.
flight switch. But there are often choices you have to make, right? So that can be definitely something that pauses people and go, oh my gosh, where do I go? I have clients reach out all the time, like I just got this new job. Here's the questionnaire, right, on the 401k. Can you help me out? So yeah, we can definitely cover some of those things right now.
Great. And in respect to a couple of sessions ago where we talked about the risk assessment tools that you shared with us, do you feel that has a place like the everybody should go through that first before we start talking about the 401k so they have an approximation of where they are risk tolerance wise with the tools?
I think that's a great place to go. Yeah. So if you do check out our prior video on risk tolerance, we've got a tool that we've listed in there that you can use for free, right? Easy to do, or you can find one online. But yes, that's a brilliant idea. But put yourself in that spot when you're thinking about risk tolerance, right? One of those boxes on most of those questionnaires is, right, time. How much time
Time.
do I
Yep.
have until I need to start withdrawing? That's very specific, right, to that bucket, right? How much time do I have before I start withdrawing funds? And then the second question that often comes up with this, with when you're thinking about retirement is not just when do I start taking funds, but how long do I want those funds to last me? So if you're 10 years out from retirement, that might be one of the questions, right? 10 years before I start withdrawing. but you might live another 40 years, right? So you might want to make sure you have that timeline really mapped out before you get answering some of those risk tolerance questions, because
That's great.
sometimes as human beings we get emotionally invested in our money. That's totally normal. And then we start thinking about today. What do I want to have happen today? But that might be short-sighted. You might want to be thinking longer term with this bucket.
Great. And that really that's what this bucket is really intended for in total anyway. So how great to marry those two together where we've got a long-term outlook as well as a long-term product,
Yep,
right? Or
that's right.
offering from a
Matching up.
the corporate point of view as this is an employee retention tool where employees have now different options than they had 40 years ago, right? We have,
That's right.
some of the defined benefits plans have changed drastically with the invention of the 401k. So now that an employee is eligible, yeah, run with it. Take us through. What is this thing?
Awesome. So I'm going to pull up a sample of something called a summary plan document, right? And that's a very technical term. So if you are new to an employer, or just like Karl said, you just reached your eligibility, right? You've done enough time with the employer. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, and you're now getting an email from the HR director or maybe the owner, and you're saying, hey, you're eligible. This is a great document, right? It's a free document. It's required by law to be given or provided to you if you request it. So I thought I would just bring a sample along. I took out the name of the company and write all the key people to protect the innocent, so to speak.
That's right. Thank
But
you.
let me grab my slides here and see if I can bring up that summary plan description. And Karl, let me know if that shows up on your side.
Got it.
Wonderful. All right, so here's that word again, right? Summary plan description. Now, the IRS and the Department of Labor are very clear with this. It is the formal name. Every single plan has one of these, and it's basically the rules to the road, right? And wouldn't it be nice just to have the rule book of your company's 401k plan? It is specifically written so that it doesn't have a lot of jargon, right? This is a very specific requirement that every 401k plan have a summary plan description. You also might hear it be named an SPD, right? Which just is the summary plan description initials, right? SPD. So every plan has this. Ask your HR director. It is a free document, or the owner of the business, right? And I'm sure they can get you a copy of this. So what I thought I would do is just, it's not horribly long. Many of them are, 10 to 20 pages. This one happens to be 19 pages. It depends on how many features and benefits are in the plan. But I just thought I would hit some of the highlights just so that our listeners could see what should they expect in here, and maybe kind of some key things to look out for. I think one of the best places to start, I know it sounds a little silly, is just the table of contents. You can actually get a really good idea of what you might be looking for in here. And one of those things that you just mentioned, Karl, is eligibility, right? So right off at the top, right here is eligibility. I'll go through some of these specific pages, but it might take you upwards of a year before you're even eligible. So sometimes new employees might not get a chance to even see, right, this coming because maybe they're a year out. But I would always tell folks, talk to your HR director sooner, right? Even if you just got hired, I tell people, get that summary plan description now so you already have a game plan, right, when it comes to your eligibility being met. So that's a good one. Another one I'm gonna hit as we go down this road here is Roth contributions. And this is a really, really big topic. We talk to a lot of our employers. We actually design and implement plans, right, for 401ks for employer clients, but we also help our individual clients do this. But if you have not looked into doing a Roth or a Roth IRA, this is a really big aha moment, right, Karl, which is having something that's tax-free forever and ever, right, is a pretty big deal, right? If you can put money away in that long-term bucket for 10, 20, 30 years, that tax-free part of that money growing in there is going to be huge. So I want everybody that's going to be looking at their summary plan description, I want you looking for that Roth contribution option, right? That's a key piece to look out for. Another piece I'm going to hit in a few minutes here is vesting. Sometimes this gets really confusing for folks. You will always have your money that you put into the 401k in your account. Your money is always going to be available to you if you leave that business. But if the employer puts in something called a profit sharing, which we're going to talk about in a minute, right? You might want to know if they're putting in money there might be a timeline that you have to work there, right? It's called a vesting schedule. But that way it incentivizes the employee, right, to be with the plan a little bit longer so that you get their contributions in the profit sharing. So that's something to look out for, right? That's really, really important. Another thing that we'll chat about here in a few minutes is distributions, right? A lot of new clients come to us and say, oh, I'm in an emergency situation. What are some of those tools I can use at the 401k? It is really hard to get money out of a 401k once it's in there. So we want you to just be thinking about those buckets again. Don't think of this as a savings account. Think of this as that long-term, right? That long-term option. But there are some opportunities that if you're in a hardship situation down here, if something is really, really ugly happening in your life, a lot of those things are unpaid medical expenses, right? Disability or a death of a key family member. So there are some things that you can use to access the 401k, but I definitely would not want to counsel somebody to think of that as that first spot, right? That first item. And then the other thing I'll just point out down here on the final piece, and then we'll jump into some of these things, and Karl and I can chat about things that we come across that are important for clients. But it's also good to know that, it's also good to know that there's fees associated with these plans, right? So I want to make sure every investor knows there's no free lunch, right? You just have to know that there's going to be fees for 401k plans or IRAs or Roths. But just knowing that, right, and being able to understand what the costs are, that's really important. Just like it would be if you get your taxes done with a CPA or you get your wills or powers of attorney drafted with an attorney, right? It's good to know what those things can be. So right here in the first 2 pages of this summary plan description, you can get a sense as to what's kind of coming next in the plan. But what I think one of those biggest opportunities that you can learn a lot about, right, is something called a match. So, Karl, do you ever run across people, right, with match, right, that maybe it's a little confusing to them on what that means?
All the time. And I think, one of the biggest myths on the match piece is um, employees that, they may have an employer who gives a certain amount of money and matches the employee's contribution, and which always leads to a conversation of, from the employee's perspective of, that's all I should do. So if an employer, let's say, does 50 cents on the dollar, up to a maximum of 3%, and the employee puts in the 3%, and the employer puts in their half, and then employees have this tendency to just stop there, thinking that there's really no benefit. Oftentimes, is what I hear, exceeding what the match is. And the thing I love about the match is, and we get, this may be a strange way to look at it, but the match is basically a guaranteed 100% return on your money when it's free money going into your plan.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that's worth repeating again, by the way. It's that important. So those two things, but let me take the second one first. If you put in 4% and your employer matches that 4% and they put 4% of their own employer money into your account, we can't say that that's a rate of return per se as an investment, but let's be clear, you just doubled, right? That
Correct.
amount. That's 100% more than you put in yourself. Now, I do like to think of it as it is a gain. It's a gain. It's a financial gain for the participant or the employee or the client. But how powerful is that? There is
Huge. There's
no
nothing like it.
there's no other tool where, again, can't say that it's an investment return, but it's an increase in your balance
Your capital. It's like a capital return, right? I mean,
that you didn't have to make an investment choice or
yep.
take an investment risk with. Like that is so powerful. I can't stress it enough. If you watch this video and there's only one thing, there's only one thing you
Correct.
take away from this video is get into the 401k as soon as you can. And at least, although I agree with you, Karl, at least get the money off the table from the employer. It's coming from their pocket. It's a commitment, right, that the employer is making to you as the employee. Holy smokes, you got to get in on that.
And take every dime of that. That's essentially free money in that sense. And if we go to your example of, if the employee, contributes 4% of their their gross pay and the employer contributes 4%, don't shortchange that. Don't only put in 2% to try it out.
Correct.
Crank that thing up and at least at the very minimum, take every dime of match that the company offers because you could be there a long time and people tend to not look at the 401k settings again until
Correct.
the next open enrollment. And
Yeah.
even then they're like, nope, I've already signed up. Everything's
Yep.
done. Moving on. They focus on other things. And I think don't miss the opportunity to collect as much of that match as humanly possible.
Correct. Here's another twist that I see with married couples, right? Often with married couples, or domestic partnerships, right? Where both individuals are working. So you got to imagine we've got two in this example, two spouses that are gainfully employed, right? Let's just say they happen to be with different employers, right? You just had a good story right there. Don't stop at two if the match is at four. Don't stop short. But I've
Yep.
had to walk people through. I would rather one of the spouses, if it's a cash flow issue, like Clay, it's hard for me to bring it up, right, to that full percentage to get that full match. Maybe the other spouse doesn't have a 401k match, right? Or maybe something's going on there. I would almost rather one spouse go up to the four. And then if the other 401k doesn't have a match to it or something like that, then reduce that one, right? Reduce one spouse down to increase the other spouse to get all of the free money. Don't make it a cash flow issue. Just understand that you might have two sources of income. And at the end of the day, you still need to afford groceries. I can totally appreciate that, right? But don't leave the money on the table. Think outside the box. Find a way where you can either reduce expenses if you can, or just shift where the income and contributions are going to, right? Because you might not be getting a match like this in your personal Roth, right? That's not happening, or your personal IRA.
Right.
So if you're contributing to a personal Roth or personal IRA and one spouse is leaving money on the table with the employer, yeah, shift gears, right? Don't put money into that bucket or change your contribution in the other spouse's 401k so you get the free money, right, from that one employer. Get all of the free money, like Karl said. Get it all that you get, every single dollar that you can.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because there's another thing that always occurs that I hear about too, which is I think that the reality of the situation on the 401k tends to be that the percentages are low enough where the actual employee doesn't really feel it
Right.
all that much. And use opportunities if you have some bandwidth of, okay, let's say you're contributing 4%, but your maximum might be 15. Every opportunity that you have a raise or a bonus is a very good reason to go in because these things can often be changed on the fly
Yep.
during the year, where a lot of open enrollment corporate benefits for employees are not really modifiable during the year after you've made a selection.
That's right.
The 401k contribution, though, that's your money. You're allowed to change that during the year.
Yep.
And so if you were at 4% and you got a raise, you could easily do a quick calculation and say, well, I could go to 5 and not feel a difference in my net paycheck.
That's right.
And that's a great way to scale up towards the maximum. And why do we say that? Well, my experience is, you can never have too much money in retirement.
That's right. We've never had anybody complain about that.
Nobody ever
Um,
complains about that. I'm
yep.
too much. And if you do, great. There are other opportunities then if you have too much money in retirement.
Yep. So I'm going to go back to something you said a few minutes ago. Don't stop at the max
Mm.
match, number one, and then combine that with the second concept you just had, Karl, there, which is when you get a raise, challenge that contribution you have going into the 401k, right? If you kind of put all of these thoughts together, the rule of thumb, I think, and these are always good to share, I think, on these videos, the rule of thumb is you need to be saving 10 to 15 to 20%, depending on what your standard of living is, what that looks like in retirement. But somewhere in that 15% range, I think is a great rule of thumb. So if you're not already saving that in the buckets that we were talking about, maybe the midterm and the long-term buckets, we need to get you to 15. So if it starts with 4 or 5 and that's comfortable to you and you're getting the maximum match from the employer, start there. Nobody wants to run too close, right, on a monthly basis or cash flow issues or can't go to the grocery store. But you got to challenge it. The way I think about it, it's like the boiling frog, right? We're not asking you just to start cold turkey and, right, jump into the boiling pot of water at 15%. But a slow increase, you shouldn't notice that, right? You should be able
Right.
to say, hey, I'm going to start at 5. I'm going to get all that money off the table. And when you do get a raise, Karl, just like you're saying, you got to consider if you get a 5% raise, bump a couple percentage points of that into the 401k. But if you can increase 1%, right, maybe every 6 months, I think you're going to find you're not going to see that it's missing from your paycheck. It's just not even going to be on your radar. Don't go cold turkey and try to do all 15 at once. I think that's pretty hard to do. But if you can just slowly increase that, that's a really powerful, right? Really powerful way to take advantage, not just of the match, but out of sight, out of mind. One of our videos, we talked a lot about that, right? With that short-term
Yep.
bucket. Yeah. If you can get it out of sight, out of mind, and it's not staring you in the face, in your personal checking account, it's in the 401k. That's a perfect spot for it to be.
Totally agree.
So the next thing I thought maybe after the match, right, is profit sharing. What makes those things different? So I thought I would find the profit sharing section here, right, especially with this vesting schedule, right, which I've got up on the screen right now. So we get a lot of clients, Karl, that get confused by this. What's the difference between a match and a profit share, right? A match, you're putting in money and the employer is matching what you're putting in up to a certain limit. So it's really your money being the driving force, right, to get the money from the employer. With a profit sharing, it's the employer only sharing profits of the company, right? It does not require the employee to put in money. So a lot of times what they do is they do some sort of calculation, right? They take your payroll, for example, and they compare it to the total payroll of the firm, and they might have X hundreds thousand dollars to share with the whole firm in profits. They're just going to proportionally pay you the amount that you are owed out of the total payroll, right? And that's what keeps it pretty fair. There are other calculations that they can use with the Department of Labor and the IRS, but we often see them use the compensation calculation, right? It's easy, it's simple, and it's fair, right? Because it kind of takes into account people at different income brackets. But you might get a 5% a 5% profit sharing from the company, and you haven't had to put in a dime. That's even better, right? So you can get a
Right.
match. A lot of plans have a match and a profit share, right? That gets put on the table. I mean, that's like really, if you have an employer, by the way, that has both, you've got a really solid employer plan, right? Match and profit sharing. Doesn't mean that you don't have a great employer if you don't have those both. I'm just suggesting if you do have them both, that's an amazing combination right there.
Agreed. And so what we'll oftentimes see is, in my world, of course, oftentimes as people are um, trying to come up with down payment funds and funds for closing for a home, oftentimes we'll look at the 401k as a possibility, and I'm sure we'll get into the differences later, but a 401k loan where you're taking a loan against your own plan's money of your money for the future, but you're borrowing it today, and this vesting schedule comes in to play because if if those funds from the employer haven't been there for a certain period of time, oftentimes we don't get to use that, even though it gets calculated in your balance that you may see on your statement. That vesting schedule is really important because, and it'll show right on the statement how much, what percentage is vested
Yep.
of those employer funds. And I think that that's a really important thing to know what that is. And then this is a great chart. Now, I think, there's many different plans, of vesting schedules. But looking at that is a really important metric.
Yep. And this is what the one that's up on the screen is what we call a graded vesting schedule, graded, because you can see by the percentage there, it's about 20% per each band, right? In between year 2 and 3, year 3 and 4, right? You're seeing that 20% increase. So by the time you're with the employer, in this case, 6 or more years, you're 100% vested after that, right? So every dollar they put in is a profit sharing. Need to know any money that goes in as a match is not subject typically to this type of vesting schedule. So that is pretty typically going to stay 100% with you if you move to a new employer. But this profit sharing piece, you will often see a vesting schedule as an incentive, right, for you to stay longer at the employer. Another tool that they use is something called cliff vesting, where you might see 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then at the 60 or 100%, right?
Yep.
Or you might see bigger steps that way. The one on the screen is called graded, right? A little bit each year. Or you might see a delayed big step, right? Type of vesting schedule, right? Which they call cliff vesting. So you might see one of those two different ones. But again, it's an incentive for you to stay, right?
Can you help
So
us
those are the,
understand the vesting in terms of for the employee, the reason that the vesting really matters is that if they were to leave employment, right, and transfer this plan or roll it over, some of those funds you may sort of leave on the table behind you
that's right.
if that's not vested. So, can you kind of walk us through the mental, if we've been there in this chart, hey, we've been there 3 years, um, but we haven't been there 4 years, right? And so we were at that 40% vesting, that there is some money in that profit sharing that if you were to leave employment and find a new job, that you would not take 100% of those profit sharing funds that they've put into the account.
That's right. So let's say that the employer put in 10,000 of profit sharing dollars for you. So on your balance, it might show that all that 10,000 is in there for you on top of what you've put in, right? But the 10,000 is the profit sharing part. But when you leave, you might only get 4,000 of the 10,000. So you're going to say, where did that other 6,000 go? Right. And just like you had mentioned, Karl, it stays in the plan with the employer, right? And then they can use it for other matching or other profit sharing in the future. But you're correct. Yeah. So this is really key. You really need to grab your summary plan description. I think knowing this in advance is really powerful. It kind of neutralizes the concern. The problem is if you don't know this and you go to leave and your brain has already looked at the balance and said, oh, I'm going to roll over 20,000, 80,000, $100,000. But now that 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 is missing, it can really drive people crazy, right? So knowing this in advance is really important. Understanding what it means. You can even call the 401k provider or your HR director if you're curious right now and just ask the question, hey, is any of my balance subject to a vesting schedule? And if so, how much is that right now? So you can have a good understanding of what that means, especially if you're thinking about, you don't need to tell the HR person, but especially if you're thinking about making a change with your employer or going to a different employer, it's good to know before you make that change, right? Or at least have the right expectation.
Yeah, and another thing that I think may be important for people to know is that that vesting schedule doesn't repeat or start over,
Correct.
right? So if you've been an employee for 10 years at this firm, but they maybe only did profit sharing 9 years ago, but you're vested in those funds, and then they had a period of time where they didn't distribute any profit, and they do it again, it does not start over.
Correct.
Once
That's right.
vested, always vested.
That's right. Yep. So the more years that, yeah, definitely you get credit for that. So that is a good point. That's a very good point. So maybe I'll jump to the hardship section because you brought up loans, and that's maybe a good spot just to talk about some of those loans or hardships. So I jumped right to loans. This is not a guarantee, by the way. It's about 50% of employers we see these days that do allow for loans. So I'm just going to put that out there. So if you are looking at your 401k or you're considering using funds from your 401k to do something like Karl was mentioning, maybe you're looking at, right, some opportunities in the real estate space, et cetera. Double check with your HR director first. It's about a 50-50. And the reason why we see some employers not do it, because the loan itself adds some administration to the process because they're going to have to monitor, the employer is then going to have to monitor and manage that loan to you, right? And some employers are like, hey, we're just keeping the wheels on the bus, day-to-day operations, doing our primary goal as a company. We might not have the staff or the ability internally to administer, right, that loan, which is really a payback schedule, right? They have to deduct the payments from your paycheck, typically over a 5-year period, up to 10 years, but most of the time a 5-year period. There are some exceptions for some things like primary residence purchases, things like that, that you can extend that loan payment. But if the loan is not available, you want to know that as soon as possible, right? And understand what it looks like and if they could administer it. So there are
Well,
definitely,
especially on my side of the world, because if a 401k loan is not an option, then you're basically down to potentially a withdrawal or a hardship withdrawal, which I know we're coming to next. And
yep.
and these are very different things.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, so a hardship, right, can be, right, and it's going to go from this page here. I'm going to flip to the next page, what we call an in-service distribution, right? But it can be a lot heavier taxes, penalties, right? And maybe even preventing you from participating in the 401k plan moving forward. But there are some reasons why you would do it, right? So you can see what the reasons are in your plan, right? That the IRS allows for, which would need to be considered immediate and heavy, right? And so the heavy part is it's got to be for something big, right? And important in the eyes of, right, the government, in the eyes of the Department of Labor. So you can see medical care, right? The purchase of a primary residence. Unfortunately, there is not an option for right for investment properties. Payment of tuition, right? Prevent eviction, burial or funeral expenses for a deceased parent, right? And then a couple down here at the bottom, repairing your principal residence or a disaster. So again, immediate and heavy expenses. But if you do take it out from a hardship, you have taxes and a 10% penalty to pay, right? Which can be really, really, really heavy in some cases. So it's good to kind of be ready for the what ifs, right? And I would definitely say consult with your tax preparer. Just make sure that you've got all your eyes on what could possibly happen here if you run into needing a hardship. Where the loan, you're borrowing your own money and you're paying it back, right, through time, through payroll, lot less tax, issues to consider there, but still worth chatting about with your CPA or a tax advisor.
Yeah, I agree. I'm curious too. I mean, normally when we see people that have do a hardship withdrawal, they are very heavy. These are very serious things, and you're penalized heavily through the
Yeah,
taxation piece to get, your money back that you've contributed. So, I like to think of this as sort of the last line of defense. You want to examine every other option before
agreed.
you look at a hardship withdrawal from your 401k plan, because we're they the penalties are stiff,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
talk about heavy.
Lots,
What are they?
lots of taxes, federal and state. Yep. And then here's that suspension I mentioned earlier. So in this plan, there's a 6 month suspension of your deferrals. So if you have a hardship, they're also saying, hey, it must be so heavy, these heavy hardships, that you can't participate then in the plan. And some of my clients are like, well, no, I'm just trying to get into this house, primary residence, or whatever. I still want to participate. But it's kind of like, okay, but then that's what I would call an additional penalty, right? The additional penalty is now you can't participate in the plan, and that might affect at some point, depending on when you took the hardship, your ability to get the maximum match, right? So you
Yep.
really do have to be thinking ahead of this, right? Ahead of this with if you're working with Karl getting your mortgage, or you're working with your CPA, right? What the taxes and potential issues there might be. So make sure you know that you might have a suspension as well, right, on your contribution. So that's a pretty big additional piece too.
Love it. Well, this is a great place for us to pause and come back and resume the rest of our long-term bucket discussion and 401k options. So we will be back in just a few moments. Thanks so much, Clay.
Thanks.